The day they celebrated her divorce was the day they unknowingly celebrated her freedom. The crystal chandelier scattered warm light across the conference room, reflecting off polished mahogany and half-filled champagne glasses. Danielle Carter sat at the end of the table, her fingers resting lightly on a stack of papers that seemed far heavier than their actual weight. Across from her, Ethan Brooks leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Beside him, his mother, Margaret Brooks, exchanged amused glances with the family attorney. The atmosphere felt strangely festive for a divorce proceeding. Danielle noticed it immediately. The smiles, the relieved sighs, the barely concealed excitement. It was as if everyone in the room had been waiting for this moment for years. The attorney slid the final page toward her. "Whenever you're ready, Mrs. Carter." The title still carried her married name, though not for much longer. Danielle lowered her eyes to the signature line. For a second, the room disappeared. She remembered a younger version of herself standing in a church filled with flowers and music. She remembered believing that loyalty was enough to build a future. She remembered choosing Ethan over opportunities she had quietly set aside. Then the memory faded. The room returned. Margaret crossed her arms. "No reason to drag it out, Danielle." The words landed softly, but the meaning behind them was sharp. Danielle looked up. Margaret wore the same smile she always wore when she thought she was being gracious. Ethan glanced at his watch. "We all have places to be." Danielle nodded once. No argument. No speech. No tears. She picked up the pen and signed her name with calm, deliberate strokes. The scratching sound of ink against paper seemed louder than it should have been. The moment the pen left the page, Ethan released a breath and laughed quietly. Margaret immediately reached for a champagne flute. "Well," she said brightly, lifting the glass, "new beginnings." The attorney forced a polite smile. Ethan accepted a glass. Another was offered to Margaret. Someone even joked that the room felt more like an engagement party than a divorce meeting. Laughter followed. Danielle remained seated. The celebration continued around her, as if she had already vanished. She watched Ethan raise his glass, watched his mother smile with satisfaction, watched people congratulate one another for an ending they believed benefited only them. Not a single person asked how she felt. Not a single person thanked her for the years she had spent holding together problems no one else wanted to carry. The silence around her said more than words ever could. Finally, she stood. The movement drew a few glances, but not enough to stop the conversation. She gathered a small leather folder and slipped the signed documents inside. "That's it?" Ethan asked. Danielle met his eyes. "That's it." Margaret tilted her head. "You know, this is probably for the best. Starting over at your age isn't easy." A few smiles appeared around the table. Danielle simply nodded. Then she turned toward the door. Behind her, another burst of laughter echoed through the room. Someone popped a champagne cork. The sharp crack bounced off the walls. Danielle paused for only a moment before stepping into the hallway. The door closed quietly behind her, muting the celebration. She stood alone beneath the soft lights of the corridor and exhaled. For the first time in years, there was no weight on her shoulders that belonged to someone else. Inside that room, they believed they had witnessed the end of her story. None of them realized they had just missed the first page of a completely different one. The evening air felt cooler than Danielle expected as she stepped out of the office building and onto the sidewalk. The sounds of downtown Chicago moved around her in steady waves. Car horns echoed between glass towers. Traffic lights changed. People hurried past carrying briefcases, coffee cups, and conversations that would be forgotten by morning. For the first time in years, she had nowhere she was expected to be. No family dinner to organize. No emergency phone call from Ethan's parents. No last-minute problem waiting for her the second she walked through the front door. She stood there for a moment, holding the leather folder against her chest, and realized something strange. The silence felt unfamiliar. During her marriage, everyone had known Danielle as the dependable one. If Ethan missed an important meeting, she fixed the damage. If Margaret needed help with a charity fundraiser, Danielle rearranged her entire schedule. If Ethan's father had another medical appointment, Danielle drove him herself. The Brooks family often described themselves as successful, but very few people knew how much of that success rested quietly on Danielle's shoulders. Years earlier, when Ethan launched his business, the company had been struggling. Bills arrived faster than payments. Investors hesitated, Employees left. Danielle had been working a promising position at a respected consulting firm then. Her future had looked bright. She still remembered the conversation at their kitchen table. Ethan had looked exhausted. Papers covered every inch of the countertop. He told her he needed support. He told her the company would fail without sacrifices. Danielle did not hesitate. She reduced her hours. Then she left her position completely. She told herself it was temporary. She believed they were building something together. Months became years. The company eventually stabilized. Then it grew. Then it succeeded. At every celebration, Ethan stood at the center of the room accepting congratulations. Investors shook his hand. Business magazines featured his picture. Clients praised his leadership. Danielle always stood somewhere near the back, smiling politely while carrying responsibilities nobody noticed. She managed schedules, organized events, solved crises before they became visible. She became so effective that people stopped seeing the work altogether. It simply appeared as if everything functioned effortlessly. The strange part was that Danielle never complained. She genuinely loved helping people she cared about. But over time, gratitude quietly disappeared from the relationship. Expectations replaced appreciation. Sacrifice became routine. Her presence became assumed. Then one afternoon several years before the divorce, Danielle experienced a moment she never forgot. She had arrived early to a company celebration being held at an upscale hotel. While walking toward the ballroom, she overheard a conversation through a partially open door. One investor laughed and asked Ethan how he managed to keep his wife so involved in the business without giving her an official executive role. Ethan chuckled. Then he said something that settled heavily inside her memory. Danielle likes feeling useful. Besides, she would not know what to do without us. The room laughed. Danielle stood frozen in the hallway. Nobody knew she was there. Nobody knew she heard every word. She entered the ballroom a few minutes later with the same calm smile she always wore. Nobody noticed anything different. But something had changed. That was the day she quietly stopped building Ethan's future as her own. She never argued, never announced a decision. Instead, she began spending late evenings studying markets, researching investment opportunities, and learning about rare art collections that were attracting attention among serious collectors. Small steps, private steps, invisible steps. While everyone around her measured her worth by what she contributed to their lives, Danielle had started creating something they never bothered to imagine, something that belonged entirely to her. 3 days after the divorce became official, Danielle stood inside the master bedroom that had once felt like the center of her life. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Sunlight spilled across hardwood floors and expensive furniture, touching objects that suddenly felt like they belonged to strangers. A single suitcase rested on the edge of the bed. Everything she planned to take fit inside it. Years earlier, the idea would have terrified her. Now it felt strangely liberating. She folded the last of her clothes with careful movements and zipped the suitcase shut. The sound echoed through the room like the closing of a chapter. Downstairs, voices drifted through the house. Margaret Brooks had arrived early. Danielle recognized the familiar tone immediately. Confident, certain, triumphant. She carried the suitcase downstairs and found Margaret standing in the kitchen beside Ethan. Fresh flowers sat on the marble island. A bottle of sparkling wine chilled in a silver bucket. Danielle almost smiled at the symbolism. They had transformed the house into a celebration before she had even finished leaving. Margaret glanced at the suitcase and folded her arms. "Traveling light?" she asked. Danielle set the suitcase near the front door. "I only need what is mine." Ethan leaned against the counter without looking up from his phone. "The movers can send over anything else later." Danielle nodded. "That will not be necessary." Margaret exchanged a knowing look with her son. "Well, that certainly simplifies things." The words sounded polite enough. The meaning beneath them did not. Danielle looked around the kitchen one last time. She remembered birthday dinners, holiday mornings, countless evenings spent preparing meals while conference calls played through a headset resting on her shoulder. She remembered solving problems before anyone else noticed they existed. Yet standing there now, it was as if none of those years had happened. Margaret stepped closer and lowered her voice slightly. "I hope you have a plan." Danielle met her gaze. "I do." Margaret smiled. "Good. Because without the Brooks name, life can become very difficult." Ethan finally looked up. He did not correct his mother. He simply watched. Danielle noticed that. She noticed everything. The silence, the assumptions, the certainty that she was walking away weaker than she had arrived. Margaret continued. People underestimate how much connections matter. Opportunities disappear quickly. Doors close. Danielle remained calm. Some doors should close. For the first time, Margaret's smile tightened. Only slightly. Only for a second. Then it returned. Confidence is admirable. Reality is less forgiving. Danielle did not respond. She picked up the suitcase. Outside, a black sedan waited at the curb. Nothing luxurious. Nothing dramatic. Just transportation to a new apartment across the city. Ethan slipped his phone into his pocket. Well, I guess this is goodbye. Danielle looked at him. The man standing before her barely resembled the person she had married. Not because his appearance had changed, but because she finally saw him clearly. Goodbye, Ethan. He nodded once. That was all. No apology. No gratitude. No recognition of everything she had contributed to his success. Just goodbye. Danielle walked toward the front door. Behind her, Margaret spoke one final sentence. I truly hope things work out for you. The words floated through the air like a farewell wrapped in doubt. Danielle paused with her hand on the door handle. For a moment, neither Ethan nor Margaret could see the faint smile that touched her face. They thought she was leaving with less than she deserved. They thought she was carrying only a suitcase. What they did not know was that hidden inside a private portfolio, protected by years of patience and discipline, were investments, acquisitions, and ownership records that had quietly grown while everyone else was busy overlooking her. Danielle opened the door and stepped into the afternoon sunlight. The warm breeze brushed against her face as she walked toward the waiting car. Behind her, the door closed softly. Neither Ethan nor Margaret followed. Neither of them realized they had just watched the poorest person in the room become the wealthiest one. The apartment measured less than 900 square feet, but every inch of it belonged to Danielle. On her first morning there, sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows and painted long golden rectangles across the hardwood floor. There were no voices demanding her attention, no schedules pinned to a refrigerator, no expectations waiting behind a closed door. Only silence. Real silence. Danielle stood barefoot in the kitchen, holding a ceramic coffee mug as steam curled into the cool morning air. Below her, Chicago was already awake. Yellow taxis moved through the streets like tiny pieces on a board. People hurried toward train stations. Storefronts opened for business. Life continued exactly as it had the day before, yet everything felt different. For the first time in nearly 15 years, every hour belonged entirely to her. The apartment itself was simple. Neutral walls, modern furniture, a dining table large enough for 4 people. Nothing extravagant. Anyone walking inside would have assumed she was rebuilding from scratch. Danielle preferred it that way. Appearances had fooled people before. They would continue to do so. After breakfast, she opened her laptop and settled into the corner workspace she had designed beside the window. The screen illuminated with dozens of market reports, auction records, investment analyses, and private client correspondence. The world she entered every morning was invisible to almost everyone she knew. Years earlier, when she first began studying art acquisitions, she knew almost nothing about the industry. She spent nights reading while Ethan slept. She attended virtual seminars. She learned valuation methods. She studied collectors, galleries, and emerging artists. What started as curiosity eventually became expertise. While other people relaxed in front of television screens, Danielle quietly built knowledge that compounded year after year. That knowledge became opportunities. Opportunities became investments. Investments became ownership. Ownership became wealth. But unlike Ethan, Danielle never felt the need to announce every achievement. The numbers spoke for themselves. By noon, she joined a video conference with a private consulting client based in New York. The discussion focused on several acquisitions scheduled for the following quarter. Danielle listened carefully, asked precise questions, and offered recommendations supported by months of research. When the meeting ended, the client thanked her for saving them from an expensive mistake. Danielle smiled politely and closed the call. Moments like that had become routine. Yet nobody from her previous life knew this version of her existed. That afternoon, she walked 3 blocks to a neighborhood cafe she had started visiting regularly. The smell of roasted coffee beans filled the air. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers. She ordered the same drink she always ordered, and settled into a seat near the window. A leather notebook rested beside her coffee. Inside were plans, strategies, future acquisitions, long-term projections. Every page represented choices she had made for herself rather than someone else's approval. As she reviewed her notes, her phone vibrated. The caller identification displayed Ethan's name. Danielle stared at the screen for several seconds. Then she silenced the call and returned the phone to the table. A minute later, another call arrived. This time it was Margaret. Danielle ignored that one too. She did not feel angry. She did not feel vindicated. Mostly, she felt detached. The same people who rarely noticed her contributions suddenly seemed curious about her absence. Their attention arrived years too late. Outside, pedestrians moved past the cafe windows beneath the warm spring sunlight. Danielle took a slow sip of coffee and continued reading. Her life no longer revolved around reacting to other people's expectations. It revolved around intention, discipline, freedom. As evening settled over the city, she returned home and opened a secure portfolio file on her computer. Rows of assets appeared across the screen. Several pieces had increased significantly in value during the previous year alone. One particular collection drew her attention. Rare, prestigious, quietly assembled over time. Few people knew it existed. Even fewer understood its true worth. Danielle studied the numbers before closing the file. Somewhere across Chicago, Ethan and Margaret still believed they understood exactly who she was. They thought they had measured her value years ago. The truth was much simpler. They had stopped paying attention long before she finished becoming extraordinary. Nearly 8 months passed before Danielle met Alexander Reed. The encounter happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon that seemed completely ordinary at first. Chicago's skyline disappeared behind low clouds while streams of water raced down the windows of a private gallery overlooking the river. Inside, soft lighting illuminated paintings worth more than most homes. Danielle arrived 10 minutes early for a consultation with a potential client who had requested complete confidentiality. That was not unusual. Many serious collectors preferred privacy. She removed her coat, greeted the gallery manager, and reviewed several notes while waiting. A few minutes later, a tall man entered carrying a black umbrella. He looked to be in his early 40s. Well-dressed, but understated. No designer logos. No visible attempt to impress anyone. He thanked the receptionist, closed his umbrella, and walked toward the consultation room. Danielle noticed something rare immediately. He moved through the space without expecting attention. Wealth often announced itself. This man did not. "Miss Carter?" he asked. "Danielle is fine." He smiled slightly. "Then please call me Alexander." They shook hands and took seats across from one another at a long oak table. For the next hour, they discussed emerging artists, market trends, and acquisition strategies. Danielle quickly realized she was speaking with someone who genuinely understood the industry. He asked thoughtful questions. He listened more than he spoke. Most importantly, he never interrupted. That alone made him different from many of the executives she had worked with over the years. At one point, Alexander presented several possible investments he had been considering. Danielle studied the information carefully before pushing one file aside. "I would avoid this acquisition." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Most advisors have recommended it." "Most advisors are looking at last year's performance," Danielle replied. "I am looking at what happens 3 years from now." She explained her reasoning. Market shifts, collector behavior, long-term value. When she finished, Alexander sat quietly for several moments. Then he nodded. "That is exactly the conclusion my research team reached last week." Danielle smiled. "Then your team is very good." A brief laugh escaped him. The conversation continued. By the end of the meeting, what had been scheduled as a 1-hour consultation stretched beyond 2 hours. Neither seemed eager to leave. Not because of personal chemistry alone, but because genuine intellectual respect had formed between them. As they stood near the gallery entrance, Alexander glanced toward a painting displayed under a spotlight. "Most people see price tags," he said. "You seem to see stories." Danielle followed his gaze. "Stories determine value more often than people realize." He looked at her thoughtfully. "I think that applies to people too." The comment lingered in the air for a second longer than expected. Not uncomfortable, just sincere. Several weeks passed. Then another meeting was scheduled. Then another. Their professional relationship gradually evolved into a friendship built on mutual respect. Alexander never asked invasive questions about her divorce. He never treated her as someone who needed rescuing. He never assumed her success came from luck. Instead, he treated her exactly as she wanted to be treated, as an equal. One afternoon, after concluding negotiations on a major acquisition, Alexander invited her to lunch at a quiet restaurant overlooking Lake Michigan. During the meal, the conversation shifted away from business for the first time. "You know," Alexander said, setting down his coffee cup, "the first thing I noticed about you was not your expertise." Danielle tilted her head slightly. "What was it?" "Your confidence." She laughed softly. "That surprises me." "It should not," he replied. "Most people become confident after recognition. You became confident without needing it." Danielle looked out the window toward the water. For years, she had been surrounded by people who measured value through status, titles, and applause. Alexander seemed to measure it differently. He recognized substance before visibility. What Danielle did not know was that Alexander Reed was far more influential than he appeared. Across financial markets, investment firms, and philanthropic circles, his name carried enormous weight. Yet he never mentioned it. And Danielle never asked. Neither of them realized that a single invitation, already making its way through elite social circles, would soon place both of their worlds on a collision course with her past. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in a cream-colored envelope thick enough to feel important before it was even opened. Danielle found it resting on the front desk of her office alongside contracts, reports, and routine correspondence. Most people would have recognized the gold-embossed crest immediately. It belonged to one of the most prestigious charitable foundations in the country. Their annual auction was not simply a fundraising event. It was a gathering place for influential collectors, business leaders, investors, and cultural institutions. Invitations were limited. Attendance was noticed. Danielle opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the heavy cardstock inside. The date was 6 weeks away. The location was the Grand Monarch Hotel, a landmark property overlooking Lake Michigan. The event description occupied only a few lines, but one sentence immediately caught her attention. A featured collection of rare acquisitions would be unveiled for the first time before entering private auction. Danielle read the sentence twice. Then she smiled. Across the city, similar invitations were arriving in executive offices, luxury homes, and private clubs. One of them landed directly on Ethan Brooks's desk. His assistant placed it beside a stack of quarterly reports shortly before lunch. Ethan recognized the foundation instantly. He opened the envelope and leaned back in his chair. Opportunities like this mattered. Networking mattered. Visibility mattered. Within minutes, he called his mother. Margaret sounded delighted. "Everyone important will be there," she said. "You absolutely have to attend." Ethan agreed. Business had been stable recently, but growth had slowed. New partnerships would help. New investors would help even more. Neither of them knew that another name already connected to the event would soon command far more attention than anyone expected. Meanwhile, Danielle continued her day as if nothing unusual had happened. She attended meetings, reviewed acquisitions, spoke with clients. Yet every so often, her eyes drifted toward the invitation resting neatly on her desk. Late that afternoon, Alexander arrived unexpectedly at her office carrying 2 coffees. It had become something of a habit between them. He handed one cup to Danielle and took a seat across from her desk. "You look like you are thinking about something," he observed. Danielle slid the invitation across the desk. Alexander glanced at it and smiled immediately. "I was wondering when those would start arriving." Danielle noticed his reaction. "You already knew about the event." "A little." His answer was casual, but something about it felt incomplete. "Only a little?" she asked. Alexander took a sip of coffee. "Enough to know it will attract attention." Danielle laughed softly. "That sounds suspiciously vague." "Perhaps." The conversation moved on, but not before Alexander asked one final question. "You are attending, correct?" Danielle looked down at the invitation again. "I think so." "Good." He set down his coffee cup. Some rooms reveal more truth than years of conversation. The comment stayed with her long after he left. Over the following weeks, excitement surrounding the auction grew. Financial publications mentioned it. Art journals discussed it. Industry insiders speculated about the featured collection scheduled for unveiling. Rumors spread quickly because details remained scarce. Nobody seemed to know who owned the collection. Nobody knew how extensive it was. Nobody knew why it had been kept private for so long. That mystery only increased interest. One evening, Danielle sat alone in her apartment overlooking the city lights. Her laptop displayed a secure document containing ownership records, valuation reports, and auction agreements. The collection occupied multiple pages. Years of patient acquisitions, years of discipline, years of silence. She closed the file and walked toward the window. Far below, Chicago glowed beneath the evening sky. Somewhere out there, Ethan and Margaret were preparing for the same event. They expected another opportunity to showcase themselves. Another room where status would determine value. Danielle understood something they did not. Sometimes the most important person in the room was the one nobody expected to notice. And in 6 short weeks, an entire ballroom full of people would learn exactly how dangerous it could be to underestimate someone who never felt the need to announce her worth. The night of the auction arrived wrapped in light, elegance, and anticipation. The Grand Monarch Hotel rose above the shoreline like a monument of polished stone and glass, its entrance glowing beneath rows of golden lights. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway while photographers documented arrivals from a respectful distance. Inside, crystal chandeliers illuminated marble floors that reflected every movement like still water. Guests drifted through the ballroom dressed in tailored suits and evening gowns, exchanging handshakes, introductions, and carefully chosen words. Ethan Brooks adjusted his jacket as he entered alongside Margaret. Both immediately recognized several prominent business figures. Exactly the type of crowd they had hoped to encounter. Margaret appeared energized by the atmosphere. She greeted acquaintances, accepted compliments, and moved through the room as though she belonged at the center of every conversation. Ethan followed comfortably. This was familiar territory. Appear confident. Shake hands. Be seen. Across the ballroom, waiters carried silver trays between clusters of guests. A string quartet played softly near the grand staircase. Large screens displayed information about the evening's charitable initiatives while anticipation continued building around the mysterious featured collection that would be unveiled later. Nobody seemed to know its owner. That mystery dominated nearly every conversation. I heard a European family assembled it decades ago, one guest claimed. No, it belongs to an investment group, another insisted. Speculation spread in every direction. Then the room shifted. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough for certain heads to turn toward the entrance. Danielle Carter stepped into the ballroom. She wore a simple black evening gown that reflected confidence rather than extravagance. No oversized jewelry. No attempt to demand attention. Yet attention followed her anyway. There was something different about the way she carried herself. The uncertainty that once surrounded her had disappeared. In its place stood quiet certainty. Beside her walked Alexander Reed. Their arrival generated brief curiosity among nearby guests before conversations resumed. Danielle preferred it that way. She had never enjoyed becoming the center of a room. Unfortunately for her former family, they noticed her almost immediately. Margaret was the first. The older woman's smile froze for half a second before returning. Well, she said quietly, nudging Ethan's arm. Look who decided to come. Ethan followed her gaze. Surprise flashed across his face. He had not seen Danielle in nearly a year. He expected her to look different somehow. Less confident. Less composed. Instead, she appeared entirely at ease. Margaret studied Alexander. Interesting company. Ethan shrugged. Probably a client. Neither recognized him. That would have surprised many people familiar with financial circles. Alexander's influence was enormous, but his public visibility remained limited. He rarely pursued attention. Margaret straightened her posture and guided Ethan toward them. We should say hello. Danielle saw them approaching long before they arrived. She remained calm. Alexander noticed her expression, but said nothing. Danielle, Margaret said brightly. What a surprise. Good evening, Margaret. Ethan offered a polite nod. You look well. Thank you. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, Margaret's curiosity took control. Her eyes moved across the ballroom. This is quite an event. Not exactly easy to get into. Danielle smiled slightly. No, it is not. Margaret interpreted the answer differently than intended. Well, networking opportunities can be useful for someone rebuilding a career. The comment sounded harmless enough to anyone listening casually. Danielle understood the message underneath. So did Ethan. Alexander remained silent, observing. Everyone starts somewhere, Margaret continued. Although these circles can be difficult to break into, Danielle simply held her gaze. No argument, no correction, no visible reaction at all. That composure seemed to frustrate Margaret more than any response could have. Nearby guests began moving toward the ballroom's central stage. The featured presentation was about to begin. Staff members directed attendees toward their assigned tables. Margaret glanced at Danielle's seating card and smiled faintly. Then she checked her own. Her confidence grew instantly. The Brooks table sat reasonably close to the stage. Respectable, visible, important. She assumed Danielle's assignment would be somewhere farther back. What Margaret did not know was that the seating arrangement had been carefully planned long before any invitation was mailed. And within minutes, every assumption she carried into that ballroom was about to collide with a truth she never imagined. The ballroom lights gradually dimmed as guests settled into their seats. Conversations softened into whispers. Crystal glasses rested untouched on white linen tables while attention shifted toward the stage. A massive screen illuminated behind the podium, displaying images from the Foundation's charitable projects. The evening host stepped forward to warm applause and began welcoming attendees. Ethan sat comfortably beside Margaret, both convinced they were exactly where they belonged. Their table occupied a respectable location near the front, important enough to be noticed, close enough to influential people. Margaret seemed pleased. She glanced occasionally toward Danielle's section, expecting to see her seated farther away among general guests. Instead, she noticed something strange. Danielle was not seated in the middle of the ballroom. She was positioned at one of the premium tables closest to the stage. Margaret frowned slightly. "That is unusual," she murmured. Ethan followed her gaze. Alexander sat beside Danielle, appearing perfectly relaxed. Neither seemed concerned about the attention beginning to gather around them. On stage, the presentation continued. Donation milestones were announced. Charity partners were recognized. Then the host smiled and moved to the moment everyone had been waiting for. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "tonight we have the privilege of unveiling one of the most remarkable private collections presented to this foundation in recent memory." The room immediately grew quieter. Images appeared across the giant screen. Rare paintings, historic acquisitions, pieces that collectors spent decades attempting to acquire. Soft murmurs spread through the audience. Even seasoned investors appeared impressed. The host continued describing the collection's significance. Each image drew stronger reactions than the last. Margaret leaned forward. Ethan narrowed his eyes. The estimated values displayed on the screen climbed steadily higher. Millions, then tens of millions. The collection represented a level of ownership few individuals ever achieved. "Who owns it?" someone asked from a nearby table. The question echoed throughout the ballroom. The host smiled. "That has certainly been the most popular question of the evening." Light laughter followed. The suspense continued building. "For years, this collection remained entirely private," the host explained. Its owner acquired each piece personally, demonstrating extraordinary vision, patience, and expertise. Danielle sat silently. Her expression never changed. Across the room, Ethan glanced toward her table briefly before returning his attention to the stage. The possibility never crossed his mind, not even for a second. Then the host reached into a folder resting on the podium. "Tonight," he said, "we are honored to publicly recognize the individual whose dedication assembled this collection." Every eye in the ballroom fixed on the stage. The pause felt endless. "Please join me in recognizing Ms. Danielle Carter." For one heartbeat, the room seemed completely still. Then applause erupted. Not polite applause, genuine applause, powerful applause. Heads turned instantly toward Danielle. Conversations stopped. Expressions changed. Ethan froze. Margaret's smile disappeared entirely. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Both simply stared. Danielle rose gracefully from her chair as hundreds of guests continued applauding. The giant screen now displayed her name beneath images of the collection. Years of invisible work had suddenly become visible to everyone at once. The host extended a hand toward her. "Ms. Carter, your contributions to both the arts and this foundation have been extraordinary." Danielle thanked him with a simple nod before stepping onto the stage. She did not give a long speech. She did not explain herself. She did not mention the people who once doubted her. She simply accepted the recognition with quiet dignity. Then something even more unexpected happened. As Danielle prepared to leave the stage, the host smiled again. There is one more acknowledgement we would like to make. The screen changed. A new image appeared. Several people in the audience immediately recognized the face. This time the applause began before the name was spoken. We would also like to thank Mr. Alexander Reed, whose partnership and support helped make tonight's presentation possible. The reaction intensified instantly. Around the ballroom, executives straightened in their seats. Investors exchanged shocked glances. Some guests actually stood. Ethan stared at the screen, suddenly recognizing the name. Recognition hit him like cold water. Alexander Reed was not merely a client. He was one of the most respected investors in the country. A man whose influence extended across industries. A man whose approval carried enormous weight. As Alexander rose from his seat, he walked directly toward the stage and greeted Danielle with obvious respect. Not as a subordinate. Not as someone he had helped. As an equal. The entire ballroom witnessed it. And for the first time that night, Margaret Brooks understood exactly why Danielle had never bothered defending herself. The applause continued long after Danielle and Alexander left the stage. Conversations that had dominated the ballroom earlier in the evening disappeared completely. Every discussion now centered on a single realization. The woman many people had overlooked had quietly become one of the most respected collectors and investors in the room. Danielle returned to her seat with the same calm expression she had worn all evening. She did not appear triumphant. She did not appear surprised. If anything, she seemed relieved. Years of silence no longer required protection. The truth finally belonged to itself. Across the ballroom, Ethan remained motionless for several moments. The screen still displayed Danielle's name beside images of the collection. Numbers he could barely comprehend accompanied each acquisition. He replayed old memories through an entirely different lens. Late nights when she sat reading after everyone else went to sleep. Weekends she spent attending events he never bothered asking about. Conversations he dismissed because they did not involve his business. All those years, he thought she was standing still while helping build his future. In reality, she had been building her own. Margaret looked equally stunned. The confidence she carried into the evening had vanished. For perhaps the first time in years, she had nothing clever to say, nothing to criticize, nothing to diminish. The evidence surrounding her was too overwhelming. One by one, influential guests approached Danielle's table. Museum directors, foundation leaders, investors, industry experts. They greeted her warmly and spoke with obvious respect. Several addressed Alexander as well, but even those conversations eventually returned to Danielle. Her expertise, her vision, her accomplishments. The recognition was genuine because it was based on substance rather than appearances. Near the end of the evening, Ethan finally stood and crossed the ballroom. Margaret followed a few steps behind. Danielle noticed them approaching but remained seated. Alexander quietly excused himself to speak with another guest, giving them space. Ethan stopped beside the table. For a moment, none of them spoke. The silence felt very different now. Months earlier, silence had belonged to dismissal. Tonight, it belonged to reflection. Danielle, Ethan finally said. I had no idea. She looked at him calmly. I know. He nodded slowly. You should have told me. Danielle considered the statement for a second before answering. You never asked. The words were not harsh. They were simply true. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. There was no defense available against honesty. Margaret stepped forward. We may have misjudged some things. Danielle almost smiled at the understatement. Almost. Perhaps. Margaret opened her mouth as though searching for additional words. None arrived. Apologies are difficult when they arrive years late. Eventually, she nodded once and stepped back. Danielle felt no satisfaction watching their discomfort. That surprised even her. Earlier in life, she imagined moments like this would feel victorious. They did not. They felt complete. There was a difference. The evening gradually came to an end. Guests collected coats. Final donations were announced. Staff members began preparing the ballroom for closure. Outside, Chicago shimmered beneath a clear night sky. Danielle stood near the entrance, overlooking the city lights, while waiting for her car. Alexander joined her moments later. How are you feeling? He asked. Danielle looked toward the skyline. Thousands of lights stretched across the darkness like distant stars. Peaceful, she answered. Alexander smiled. That seems appropriate. A black car arrived at the curb. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Before getting inside, Danielle glanced back through the glass entrance one final time. Inside, the ballroom remained bright. Guests continued talking. Waiters cleared tables. Somewhere among them stood people who once measured her value incorrectly. Not because she lacked worth, but because they lacked vision. Danielle turned away from the building and entered the car. The door closed softly behind her. As the vehicle pulled away, city lights reflected across the window beside her. They stretched and blurred against the glass before disappearing into the distance. She had not won Ethan back. She had not defeated Margaret. She had not spent years planning revenge. She had done something far more powerful. She had built a life so full, so meaningful, and so undeniably her own that the opinions of people who underestimated her no longer mattered. And as the city drifted past beneath the quiet glow of midnight, Danielle Carter finally understood a truth that had taken years to learn. Dignity does not shout. It glows.